Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to give just a few more seconds for people to log onto the stream and we'll get started soon. All right. Hi, I am Meredith Shiner. I'm a director at the UChicago Urban Network. We're a collection of more than 24 units on campus, and we house faculty members and practitioners across the university that focus on important urban issues facing Chicago, cities across the country, and cities across the world. Today, I'm really honored to be able to host this conversation looking at the intersection of trauma and gun violence. I think Chicago has unfortunately become political shorthand for something that should be treated and discussed more seriously than it is, because we're talking about the lives of real people in real communities, in real cities, both here in Chicago and across the country. Gun violence is a public health crisis, and that includes mental health as well. And the people who are impacted by the intersecting crises of the pandemic and of gun violence, they're more than just statistics. There are people with families and, again, communities and neighbors. And so one of the things that we really wanted to do today was to bring leaders from the university together with leaders across the country in gun violence prevention to talk about what's really happening beyond those statistics, and to talk about solutions that are centered on the humans who are impacted most, on neighborhoods and communities here in Chicago, across the country. So with that, it's really an honor to be able to introduce Lahidra. She is a reporter now at the Marshall Project, but she has deep expertise and knowledge in these areas, as she used to be a reporter just recently, earlier this year, at The Trace, focused on gun violence with a particular interest in what happens to communities and to families after they're impacted by gun violence. So with that, I will kick it off to her and her expertise to help introduce this conversation. I guess it would also help if I would introduce our panelists as well before I kick it off. We have Dr. Selwyn Rogers of the University of Chicago Medical Center. He runs our trauma center. Franklin cosey-gay, who's the executive director of the Center for Youth Violence Prevention, which is housed at our Crown School of Social Practice and Policy. Shannon Watts, who is the founder of Moms Demand Action, which is one of the leading gun advocacy groups in the country and part of the Everytown family of gun violence prevention advocacy groups, and Pastor Brenda Mitchell, who is one of the leading volunteers for Moms Demand Action here in Illinois, and can speak from the perspective of a survivor and advocate. So with that, Lahidra, thank you so much for hosting this conversation, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. And I think this is always an important conversation to have, not just here in Chicago, but across the country. So one of my first questions is, with the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course has gone on for more than 18 months now, what has this revealed about the infrastructure available to address a public health issue like gun violence? Shannon, do you want to start?
Yeah, and it's an honor to be here today with everyone, truly, and to talk about such an important issue. You know, we know that about 100 people are shot and killed every single day in this country. About 200 more are wounded. Guns are now the leading cause of death for children and teens. And then in communities that already have a disproportionate level of gun violence around Black and Brown families, you know, there's this collective trauma, in addition to all the hurt and suffering that individuals have already been experiencing. And, you know, when we look at COVID, it was a pandemic, but gun violence was really an epidemic within that pandemic. It intensified the gun violence crisis in this country, and certainly that was exacerbated by the surging gun sales that we saw. Tens of millions of guns sold in the last 2 years. And then because we have these loopholes in this country around background checks and just throughout the system of gun sales, guns have easily fallen into the wrong hands. So, you know, after this year of a pandemic exacerbating gun violence, that is why this conversation is so important. It's why the work of everyone on this panel is so important. You know, increased gun sales, increased calls to domestic violence hotlines, spikes in city gun violence, far more unintentional shootings because children are having easier access to guns than ever. All of that is clear that really immediate action is needed.
Brenda? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
I look at it and I understand the colliding crisis of gun violence and COVID-19, and having, as a survivor, experience the trauma that comes along with gun violence, and having it affect my life to the point of almost losing it 3 times over a short period of time. And when I saw the COVID survivors and the devastation that they were receiving from complicated grief and of an isolated incident that produces trauma, I took what my experience was and applied it, and have been facilitating and assisting with counseling for the COVID survivors, but not neglecting my work in the gun violence movement as well, and understanding the need to deal with the issues of trauma.
Salwan?
Thank you, Lahidra. As Shannon and Brenda noted, it has been the intersection of COVID-19 and the underlying high rate of gun violence in many of our communities. I think disproportionately, unfortunately, COVID has affected Black and Brown communities that have historically suffered the impact of intentional gun violence. And we've only seen that exacerbate over the past year and a half. In many American cities, including Chicago, there have been 50% more homicides and shootings compared to a year and a half ago. And that combination of epidemics, if you will, has really placed a significant toll on communities of color. And it reflects the fragile nature of our both our healthcare system and our social network system, that in the midst of the pandemic, things have actually gotten much worse, exacerbated by COVID-19.
And, thank you for just having an opportunity to be among this esteemed panel. And I echo all of the sentiments that were shared. And I think that what I like to highlight, given that what we understand about violence, what we understand about how persistently high exposure to violence has been in the Chicago context, primarily in Black and Brown communities that primarily can be found in the South Side and West Sides of Chicago, and been persistent and durable close to 50 years. If we can track resources, how these communities are routinely under-resourced, what does that mean? So the lack of employment opportunities, housing in general. We think about just the past 20 years, we've experienced the largest concentration of disruption of public housing. Related to that, the largest school closing in the United States history happened in Chicago. Those that web, that social network, when you disrupt that, and then you place a pandemic on top of that, we're beginning to see the symptoms that we see. I'm reminded of a quote that I saw in a local newspaper early on in the pandemic that says that, when you lose grandma was all you had. We think about mom and dads that may have already lost their jobs, right? You had someone from a earlier generation that was holding it down for the whole family. When you had that thread of support, and then now the pandemic is taking a lot of people away from us, you're disrupting resources, that thread that existed, and that's where we are right now.
Thank you. My next question touches on just how we talk about gun violence in Chicago, which tends to be focused on homicides. We see this especially in how we talk about gun violence in the news. But when you are shot in Chicago, you're about 4 to 5 times more likely to survive the shooting rather than to die from one. So essentially what we have had in the past decade or so is thousands of people who have not just been sort of direct survivors of gun violence in that they've been shot and survived, but also family, friends, and neighborhoods that have been impacted by this issue. And I just want to, hear from the panelists why we might tend to view this issue in this sort of specific singular way, and what we can do to better support survivors and their families. Franklin, do you want to go?
Thank you, Lahidra. So I'd like to say that given the events that happened, particularly around the deaths of George Floyd, that as a nation, as a world, we really began to look upstream to really kind of analyze the policies and practices that are related to race and racism. With that being said, understanding that part of why we have been impacted in terms of trusting resources that are there is that the social trust, the economic and political trust has been eroded, specifically related to practices regarding race and racism. With that being said, we understand the power of credible messengers. We understand the power of, if we're trying to provide resources for individuals that have been impacted, that an important approach is taking men and women that have actually lived that life, that they have experienced the pain. In some cases, they've also caused the pain, as people to actually deliver the connection, the warm handoff to resources. One such example has been the rise around the nation, understanding the importance of hospital-based violence intervention programs, understanding the need to have men and women that are in the trauma centers that have lived that life and they know how to connect. They possess the cultural capital to connect individuals who might not trust these institutions that have failed not only them, but they failed their parents as well, particularly in the Chicago context. And so what ways that we can take that through the hospital itself with individuals that are experiencing penetrating traumatic injuries, having a credible messenger that is connecting them to resources. Those community-based organizations also have sensitivity to not only the interpersonal violence, but also the structural violence that I talked about earlier. And so it's that approach that's important, but it's not about a singular program. It is about a comprehensive and coordinated approach to address what we're facing. Again, what we're facing is really generations in the making in terms of divestment and communities, particularly in the Chicago context, Black and Brown communities.
Selwyn?
I'll follow up on that, Franklin. With respect to 2 points, we do focus overwhelmingly in the media, et cetera, on those people who get shot and die as a result of gun violence or firearm-related injuries. But there's so many countless others that are also affected, those who are shot, but also those members of families and communities that are disproportionately affected by the impact of gun violence. And to that end, with respect to the impact of trying to deal with providing services for victims of gun violence, I think it's important to address both the physical needs that patients have, but also thinking about the mental and emotional needs that they have. As Franklin mentioned, we at University of Chicago have a hospital-based violence recovery program that basically centers around the idea that we're going to accompany patients and their families on the road to their recovery following becoming a victim of gun violence. And the importance there is probably twofold. One is to try to interrupt retaliatory violence as a form of secondary prevention. So someone who's been injured by gun violence, preventing them or their close contacts from retaliating and leading to more gun violence. And that's through our hospital-based violence recovery program, our trusted messengers, as Franklin says, who've had lived experiences, can relate to the patients who are victims of gun violence and try to engage them in a way that helps them change the course of what happens next. I think the other thing that we often don't talk about is the incredible mental health impacts on the individual, but also their families, on their sense of safety and their sense of wellness. We see every day at the Trauma Center at the University of Chicago Medicine how not just a person who's been shot, but all of their close contacts are negatively impacted by being a victim of gun violence. And it leads to anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other manifestations of mental unwellness that we often don't tackle, and we don't ignore, and we ignore. And those effects last weeks, months, years, sometimes the entire person's lifetime. And then the last comment I'll make is just the important need to reframe, to your point, Lahidra, that we often talk about the homicides, but we don't talk about prevention. And there's so much important work that we can do with primary prevention, preventing people from being shot in the first place, through investing in communities, investing in programs that are violence prevention programs that can help alleviate people being shot or injured in the first place.
Brenda?
I think I agree with what's being said. And, I never identify myself as the subject matter expert, but what I do identify myself is as the subject matter and understanding the impact of gun violence as a survivor. And initially when my son was killed, these resources were not available. And I had to learn it on my own and for myself, not very successfully, because as Dr. Rogers had said to me in a previous panel, it may take years for that to exhibit itself. And it did for me in the 12th year and for my son's sons. And so having these kind of resources on a multi-dimensional level is very important. I think the thing that guided me through my pain and recovery was being a part of Purpose Over Pain and Everytown Survivor Network and Moms Demand Action, and understanding the need for change. But I moved from the advocacy piece and talked about, I need to talk about trauma, because we're like the walking wounded. And until we deal with the issues of trauma on a personal level, as well as in our communities, then we'll continue to be the little wheel that continues to spin like the Goebbels. People often talk about a new norm, but there'll never be a new norm. What we have to do is to create the new narrative that will allow on a personal level for us to heal, but our communities to heal as well by the interventions that have been mentioned thus far.
And Shannon?
I think Pastor Mitchell makes such an important point around trauma. Our organization convened some researchers and nonprofit partners and practitioners, all from different disciplines and backgrounds, because we wanted to pull together a report on trauma, because that's really what we're talking about at the end of the day, is trauma that can fuel so much of this gun violence. And it was really a comprehensive effort to address something that is very little studied, but very damaging phenomenon. It's called community trauma. And so the report that people watching can find, it's called Invisible Wounds, Gun Violence and Community Trauma Among Black Americans. And it really digs into the traumatic impact of gun violence on Black children, on adolescents, on adults. And it can be gun violence from direct or indirect exposure. And this is part of a desire to really recognize the full toll of gun violence generationally, right? These shootings create ripple effects. They affect entire communities. And recognizing this community trauma is really an essential step in addressing it, and finding solutions and creating a safer future. And as we were talking about before, we know throughout the pandemic, kids have been exposed to these new stresses, plus elevated levels of gun violence. Now they're heading back to school. There are millions more guns inside people's homes, many of them unsecured. And that's why we're seeing, just in the last couple of months, since kids were back in school, there have been many more incidents of gunfire in school grounds than any similar period since we started tracking it in 2013. Now, the truth is that far more students actually experience gun violence in home than they do at school. But gun violence in communities, around schools, it impacts students' ability to concentrate. It impacts their ability ultimately to succeed. And so, we have to look at the root causes, and trauma can be a big part of that. So the recommendations that we make in this report for addressing community trauma include Mental health resources, we talked about that at the top of the conversation, making sure that they're culturally affirming, that they're equitable. Funding community-based violence intervention programs. I'm sure we'll talk about that more, but these programs are so incredibly important to keeping communities safe. Investing in crime prevention through environmental design. We touched on that a little bit as well. Implementing restorative justice programs, expanding economic opportunities, and then making sure we're holding law enforcement accountable in the communities where they serve.
Thank you. And Shannon, can you just repeat where people can find the Invisible Wounds report that you were talking about?
Yes, I don't have the exact link, but the report itself, and you can just Google it, it's called Invisible Wounds, Gun Violence and Community Trauma Among Black Americans.
And something that all of y'all mentioned was, of course, one of the big parts of this crisis is trauma. And I was curious, Brenda, if you would be willing to share just how you found the words to describe what you were experiencing and realize that you were experiencing trauma and all of the sort of ripple effects that that can cause.
You know, I lost my son, Kenneth. Well, I lost my brother to gun violence, and I watched the impact of that on my mother. I never thought that that would be my experience. And then I too lost my firstborn to gun violence. And what's ironic about it is that I sent his brother a week earlier. Kenneth took Kevin to the airport for his third tour of duty for Iraqi freedom, only to have to be brought back home a week later to bury his brother in a free country. And so for me, trying to deal with all of those emotions, and even Kevin going back overseas and not feeling comfortable leaving me behind. And I said to him, you have to walk to your destiny. I couldn't save your brother in a free country. I have to pray that God will take care of you the rest of your way. But I had to try to deal with being a second generation parent. I had to raise Kenneth's sons because he was the primary caregiver for his two boys, and one that was born 30 days after his death, who did not understand how everybody else knew his father but him. And now at 16 years old, informed me that he was not going to cry about his father anymore because it hurt so much. And so those two boys changed dramatically and went from being little kids to survival. What's going to happen to us? I, like I said, did not realize the effect of trauma in my life. I did not know that I was dying on the inside, and this bright, jubilant person that always had a smile for everybody was dying internally. And I had to take the time to save my own life in order to keep with the boys. And for me, it changed my life. And I knew if I was feeling this amount of pain, and this is my experience, other mothers, families, and communities are dealing with the same thing. And so I asked of every town, could I begin to speak to trauma? Can I have a platform? Because we're like the walking wounded. And when your heart is ripped out of your chest, and you know that that wound will never heal, and you wake up every morning with a broken heart, you understand the impact. And then to hear a quadriplegic Black young man express he's traumatized and his community is traumatized, it moves you to action. We're a humane society that has lost the ability to be humane and do not understand that the crimes that are being committed on humanity. So that's how I got involved, and that's how I stay involved, because it's not about me. It's about the change that I want to see.
Thank you. Well, thank you for sharing your experiences. I really appreciate it. I did want to talk about how gun violence affects youth specifically. And even though gun violence happens all across the country and all across Chicago, it does tend to be concentrated in communities experiencing high levels of poverty. And so I was curious if we could start with you, Franklin. How does growing up in these environments affect you specifically, especially when it comes to the likelihood of gun violence?
No, thank you. And I just want to raise up Pastor Mitchell for sharing. And this really speaks to why it's important for us as researchers to support the capacity building of credible agents, leaders in this work, folks that are resilient and resisting these oppressive forces that are impacting our community. I think that Pastor captured it. So first of all, you survive, and that's something, Lahidra, that you raised, is that many folks, thanks to medical science, survive. And that's something that was different, in 50 years ago. But immediately, when you survive, there is this decreased sense of safety, right? And so how do you feel safe? Folks don't understand some of our youth are being arrested for possession, for weapons. They might actually be in a program, and they actually aspire and they're moved by individuals that are providing resources for them towards a path of recovery. However, in that space, they still don't feel safe, right? And so carrying weapons for protection, we know that issues with trust that I brought up before has been eroded. And so there is no trust around, will I actually get justice for this? And so there's, for some, a desire for retribution and retaliation. And Dr. Rogers talked about crisis interventionists and case managers within the hospital-based violence intervention program, understanding here's an ideal time to really try to assess that. But that is also a part of it. And this is a larger issue. I want to raise up that, what we've talked about, what hasn't been talked about is the role of race and racism, right? So we're at this place where these traumatic events have happened, but what has happened over generations that have really been policy decisions and practices that have essentially redistributed how we invest in Black and Brown communities, right? And so getting back to your question, self-medicating with alcohol, illegal drugs as well, not to mention the physical challenges that are brought on by injuries. How does that impact your ability to be a productive member in society by holding a job? How does that impact your ability to be mentally vibrant when you're dealing with physical challenges related to your injuries? So those are specific things that I like to raise up.
Thank you. And would any of the other panelists like to add anything?
Maybe I'll add, I want to, I met Brenda 2 years ago, and thank you again. Your story is always powerful when you share it. And I'm struck by, we don't want to focus on numbers, but the tens of thousands of people who are affected by gun violence just in the city of Chicago. We do focus on the homicides. We, as the year comes to an end, there's this mad rush in terms of, are we going to pass 500, 600, 700 homicides, but we don't talk about all the people who are left behind. Those are families, communities that are incredibly devastated by the impact of firearm-related injuries. And that's both homicides and suicides in terms of people who are left behind. One of the things that we found at the University of Chicago with respect to our violence recovery program is that the needs are just tremendous. We've seen our hospital-based violence recovery program is dealing with 5,200 patients and connected with them. We've helped over 2,300 families and over 560 children. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Those are the people that we've been able to touch. The communities throughout the southwest sides of Chicago that are disproportionately affected by firearm-related injuries, they've been affected for generations. It's been decades of intergenerational poverty, chronic disinvestment in communities that have led us to be at this point. And in order to turn this all around, and we're not having this conversation the same way again a year from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we have to really change policies to the point that Franklin made, really investing in creating anti-racist policies that lift up communities, invest in communities, and address educational disparities, healthcare disparities, social disparities that disproportionately affect Black and Brown communities. It's really not pitting one group against another. It's an attempt to lift everyone up. And with that, we can actually create a more perfect union, if you will, where especially our children are lifted up and given the opportunities to live the most productive life that they can live.
Thank you. And would anyone like to add anything else? I did want to follow up on something you had mentioned, Franklin, was youth carrying guns or possessing guns in Chicago. And of course, a crucial aspect of gun violence is the fact that guns are used. And in Illinois, the criminalization of gun possession, not necessarily use, has had an adverse effect on a lot of Black communities in the city that are already experiencing a lot of hyper-policing. And I believe recent research from Loyola University has showed that this has not actually addressed more of the root causes that we think of when we think of gun violence, like poverty, unemployment, access to schools, and access to food, and all of those issues. And so I'm curious to hear from the panel, what holistic approaches can we take to build communities up while also addressing concerns around gun use and access? Shannon, do you want to start?
Sure. You know, as I mentioned, the trauma report that we had that came out recommended some very specific things around mental health, violence intervention programs, investing in crime prevention through environmental design like green spaces, restorative justice, economic opportunities, and then holding law enforcement accountable. You know, what we focus on a lot as an organization is easy access to guns and how to close the loopholes that give people who shouldn't have guns easy access to them. You know, I started Moms Demand Action when I lived in Indiana and quickly realized the lax gun laws in that state were really fueling the Indiana to Illinois gun pipeline. And that's why a lot of the work we do focuses on strengthening the nation's background check law. It really is a key way to address the interstate gun trafficking that is fueling so much of the gun access in Chicago and cities all across the country, not just Chicago. But when you look at the data, about half of fully traced crime guns in Illinois actually came from out of state. So about nearly 90% of them come from states that have weak to no background check laws, like Indiana. And so we have been waiting for this cathartic moment in Congress where they would finally pass life-saving background check legislation. That hasn't happened. It is coming. But in the meantime, you know, we have been going state by state to address these loopholes. However, you know, we're all only as safe as the closest state with the weakest gun laws, and federal inaction on this issue is really what is leading to the over 100 Americans who are shot and killed every single day. Hundreds more are wounded, and not to mention the fact that this costs U.S. taxpayers about $35 million every single day. As you mentioned, you know, Chicago has sort of become this political shorthand, especially in Republican circles, for violence. But they don't talk about how the guns even get to the city. Where do they come from? How can trafficking be curbed? There was actually an investigation into a shooting that killed a Chicago police officer in 2018. And then authorities found these shell casings. They were from the same gun and they're linked to another shooting in Chicago, just 2 months before it was purchased in the state of Wisconsin, a state with weak gun laws. And, you know, when you look at this deficit, it really does create a gun trafficking scheme. And it led to the murder of a police officer. And we see this all the time. These stolen guns are used in many different crimes and then end up in Chicago. And so ultimately, that is why, you know, we work on strengthening gun laws. And we have had actually a lot of success in the state of Illinois. Just last August, Governor Pritzker signed into law monumental legislation that strengthens the background check system in the state. It provides funding for gun violence intervention programs. This was no easy task. It took years and years of advocacy and relationship building. It was a very broad coalition of gun violence prevention advocates and organizations, including Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action. And another key ingredient to the success was that one of the state representatives, Maura Hirschauer, who is very passionate about this, is actually a former Moms Demand Action volunteer in Illinois now. We helped get her elected, and she's been very influential in getting that bill across the finish line. But at the end of the day, this is about changing the laws in part that allow easy access to guns.
Brenda? Sorry, you're muted.
I don't really have that much to offer, but I think the other thing is the current issue of even ghost guns, and to understand the trending behind that and why legislation to control that issue is very important, because it gives easy access and creates an even bigger problem on the streets of our children in Chicago and across the nation. And so we're really fighting the issue and getting legislation around ghost guns so that we don't have that as a further issue. It's an issue, but if we can nip it in the bud now, we can decrease that access in our communities.
Selwyn?
I think what I would add beyond what was said before by Brenda and Shannon about the guns themselves is the important work we can do around primary prevention, preventing people from firing a firearm in the first place. That starts with greater investment in primary prevention efforts, which entail economic opportunities, fighting racism, addressing poverty, all the upstream factors that lead people to be more at risk of being a holder of a gun that's potentially going to do harm to someone else. But then also, I think really investing in primary prevention programs for our youth. At the University of Chicago, over the past several years, 3 years, we've given about $350,000 to various youth violence prevention programs that are community-based. But that's a tip of the iceberg in terms of what the needs are. And I think if we had greater federal, state, and local investment in youth prevention efforts, we would see the fruits of that investment. We talk about the impact every day of $35 million or so of harm that's done with a gun. You think of how we would be benefited by investing that $35 million in youth development and other initiatives to have an impact.
And Franklin?
Yeah, no, thank you. I'd pick right back up where Dr. Rogers left off, investing in primary prevention. Most of our work has primarily focused on that, understanding that particularly family-based work, engaging families, help get at most of the risk and protective factors that are related to our common youth problem behavior outcomes. I get a little worried when we talk specifically about just guns in general, but not really focusing on the root cause, and that is that hurt people are hurting people. They would do that with knives. I understand the fatality rate with guns are certainly something to be, that certainly separates that, but we need to get at the root cause. And primary prevention is important. I think as Dr. Rogers mentioned, it's also who is delivering that primary prevention, understanding the issue of credibility, right? It has to be people who have connections, have trusted relationships that were built over time, in many cases over generations. In what ways can we leverage resources, whether it's through the university or other institutions, collaborating together to build their capacity to deliver programs in a meaningful way so they can know that they're actually having impact on their programs, and also understand what is actually working. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
If I could add one additional point, the benefits of investment in youth, and especially youth in chronically disinvested communities, can be tremendous. What we see day in and day out at University of Chicago's Trauma Center is that Someone who comes in who's been the victim of a firearm-related injury, when you talk to them and get their history, it will relate, a cousin, a brother, a sister, a father who's also been a victim of gun violence, and the reverberating effects of that throughout one family, as Pastor Mitchell was mentioning, goes through generations. And if you have an impact on one, you can have an impact on many. And so it's not really just thinking about investing in an individual, but it's really about investing in the community.
Thank you. And just a note to our audience that we have about 20 minutes left. So if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll answer those shortly. Another question that I had is related to the issue of suicides, which are the biggest result of gun deaths in America, but we often do not talk about them in the same way. Last year, I reported on a rise in suicide deaths happening in Chicago, and especially in Black communities, in the same communities experiencing COVID-19, opioid overdoses, and other types of gun violence that we've been discussing this past 40 minutes or so. And I'm curious what you're hearing from the communities that you serve, both locally and nationally, about, mental health needs and accessibility and being able to get help. Franklin, do you want to start?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this really speaks to work that we've been supporting over the past 6 years. It's led by the dean of the school, the Crown Family School of Social Work, which is essentially a pastor, Pastor Chris Harris, came to us, understanding the impact of mental health needs, understanding, just like we shared, we have Pastor Mitchell here as well, that many of the residents, when they need to deal with the mental health needs, first of all, I talked about school closings, I talked about housing, also our mental health clinics are virtually gone, right? So when we talk about divestment, where are the resources? So as a pastor, he understood that folks came to him. What ways can we build support and build the capacity of folks that are boots on the ground, that they have trusted relationships with, to build their capacity to be frontline, essentially providing trauma-related services to address, because there's an issue connected to trust. And so that's exactly what we've been doing through this work, is mobilizing a comprehensive, coordinated approach that is centered around trauma-informed care, building up everyone's awareness about why that's important. One thing that Pastor Harris says is that when it comes to mental health, there's a stigma, particularly for our people, right? And so the stigma is related to, I don't know what it is, I don't know if I could trust you. And then even if I can trust you, can I afford it? And so what he's been mobilizing around this through a network of other faith-based leaders and other community stakeholders is really getting training from licensed clinical social workers and psychologists to really make this more translatable. And again, it is the trusted partnership that's important, because these are individuals that are from the community, like Pastor Mitchell, that have been impacted themselves. And so when you're building up and mobilizing around the importance of that, while also pushing policy about why has our city divested in these resources, at the same time building up from the ground, from the roots, but also addressing, upstream to impact policies is extremely important. I'm very proud of the comprehensive collaboration work that's been happening in the greater Bronzeville community that's just outside the university, but certainly there are more resources that are needed towards that.
And would any of the panelists like to add to that?
I certainly would add that there's I'm sorry, Pastor Mitchell, go ahead. Okay.
No,
I was
going to say that I agree with, what's being said, and that I think that there needs to be more trauma-informed care centers for us to be able to deal with the issues. Because while I do identify that mental health is one bucket, but I think that when you look at trauma, I'm affected differently from trauma. I had an isolated incident that threw my physical and my emotional being into a different place. And so I think that when we deal with trauma, we have to address it. And there's so many caregivers out there that do not reflect or do not identify with people of color. As a pastor, I got a lot of accolades from the faith community because it's like Franklin said, my community, if God and I can't handle it, it's not meant to be done. And so for a pastor to say, I'm vulnerable, I'm weak, I'm broken, I'm fragile. And, I believe that the word says in that day, knowledge would increase. Knowledge that has increased is the Dr. Selwyn Rogers, the Franklin cosey-gays, even Pastor Brenda Mitchell's of the world, and Shannon Watts, that says, there has to be another method, and trust does play a part in what we do and how we do it. So I use my platform to say I'm a servant. I'm still a servant beyond whatever else the impact was on my life.
I was just going to share that from the both a patient and provider perspective, the incredible stigma that there is about mental health and mental wellness is one that we need to shatter. If someone has a broken bone or an open wound, they don't say, I'm not going to go see a doctor about that. And I think similarly, we have to get to a reframing about what mental health is, and it's just a component of who we are as people. And if we don't pay attention to our mental wellness, we're going to suffer both physically and emotionally. And I would also say that one of the challenges that we found, especially in the South Side, is that we often don't have enough mental health providers who are culturally competent, culturally sensitive in a way that meets the needs. So there's both a dearth, there's not enough, and there's not enough that actually connects and can connect with the people that we need to be served. And then we have the other problems that the demand is not where it should be. It needs to be even higher than it is, because trauma affects all of us. And as a provider myself, when I have one of those nights where multiple people come in who are young Black men who could be my kids, it hurts me, and I walk away from those experiences change in a way that not change the same way that their families are, but their screams and their cries stay with me. And I think that if we can think about ways that we can actually address that in a more holistic way, we can have people that are more recovered after these unfortunate incidents. And then we just have to also really push hard on the issue of prevention. We have to get better at preventing these things from happening. We are #1 in the world in terms of gun-related, firearm-related injuries. We need to strive to not be #1. And I think that that is really one of the things that we need to political will in this country to change, so that so many people's lives aren't so negatively impacted by firearm injuries.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions from the audience. So I'm just going to go through them. Sorry, now I'm scrolling. So one person from the audience asked, how can someone who is not from these communities but wants to build trust within them and do the hard work to help combat these issues start establishing those connections and build trust? They've heard several times now that the work can be done by someone who comes from these communities and has trust, but there are other people who want to do this hard work as well.
I'll start by saying, the first thing you can do is show up. I mean, I think people really respond to people who are willing to meet them where they are and engage them as another human being. We're all different, but we're also all the same. People love, live, pray, play, and realizing that humanity in all of us is one way to become engaged. Pastor Mitchell said it well initially. We need to maintain our humanity and see the human in each of us.
Yeah, I like to just add, just pick up off of humanity. It makes me think of a book by Paulo Freire that talked about pedagogy of the oppressed. And essentially, oppression is when you don't recognize the humanity of another individual. And so one thing that really struck me is that when it comes to liberation from oppression, that it must come from within. And so I agree that showing up is important, but it's important to show up with humility. It's important to understand that the experts are the individuals that are dealing with it, that they have dealt with it within their families, within their communities, and unfortunately with across generations. So when I have an opportunity to talk to students, that's a common question that we have. Many times, unfortunately, a lot of our students are being trained are not from these communities that they're looking to serve. And so it's a big issue. I think that is a divide that we need to address as well, is making sure that the experts like the Pastor Mitchells and others, that they are actually leading this work, and they're having the capacity to be it, but they're also that they're in these classrooms, that they are building the skills to lead this work. But to get back to a quick question, how do you do it? I agree with Dr. Rogers, but I would just add with humility.
I just want to say, because I agree with everything that's being said, and yet there's still some people that come from outside of the community that is doing some great work in some of the communities that, would normally not embrace that, the Maria Pikes of the world who's doing some great work in Inglewood, Pam Bosley in Auburn, Gresham with St. Sabina in the faith community, there with Purpose Over Pain. And even those people on a national level that may not have been impacted by gun violence, but the need to advocate for change. And so I have to acknowledge them as well, because for some of us, the advocacy piece creates a balance that as survivors, we may not get in and on our own, because we see things very differently, even when it comes to the issue of gun violence and being a survivor and what advocacy should look like. So I just want to acknowledge some of the work that's being done outside of our communities and inside of our community by outsiders. But great work by everyone that puts their hands to the plow, as the old folks used to say.
Thank you. And another question that we have from an audience member is about gun use and how it can be different depending on which community you're talking to, or whether you're in Chicago or in the suburbs. And just to paraphrase a bit of their question, they're wondering if taking guns out of Black communities, which they feel seems impossible, if that is the primary solution we should be focusing on.
There's so many different, like I said, it's a very multi-dimensional task in trying to deal with the issues of prevention and gun violence and having guns in our community. Another thing that is huge for the community, and I know Marsha Lee is on this call as well, and that is the issue for families that still have unsolved cases, with no protocol and nothing in place to identify what do we do with that. And I talked with the police commissioners and chiefs, and I said, when you look at that, you look at it as a crime scene. When we look at it as sacred ground, because everything that we love, we've lived through our worst day in that moment. And that there needs to be more things addressed along the lines of unsolved cases. How do you deal with the family? How do you gain trust to even be able to deal with the family? Because when it's a public figure, police officer or some, the crimes can be solved, but yet, we cannot have that level of satisfaction for the unsolved cases in our communities in which there is no conversation and there is no protocol to assist or to deliver on outcomes.
Would any other panelists like to add to that? Okay. We do have some comments from one of the listeners about the role that police play in addressing this issue as well, since oftentimes Chicago police, which I found through my reporting, are much more likely to suspend a case and to stop investigating it. And of course, a shooting resulting in an arrest is quite low in our city. Do any of the panelists have any thoughts on this and what we should expect from the police in addressing gun violence?
I know we're short on time, so I'll just quickly add that we should not solely look at policing as a solution. I think that we should invest more in terms of community violence intervention approaches. I think that the approaches that are connected to street outreach, particularly crisis interventionists and case managers, they have the existing relationships to kind of understand the root causes, and that, or not necessarily the root causes, but what's at the root for a shooting in general. And I think that if there has been evidence that demonstrates the impact in reducing shootings and reducing homicides. There are certain cities that have invested more. I think our city could do a lot more to invest in that approach.
I would echo that comment by Franklin. I really do think that it's not an either or with respect to policing, because we do need policing to be effective and to be a trusted partner to solve violent crime. But we also need to invest more in prevention programs. And if we had a balanced portfolio of interventions, both community-based as well as that are hospital-based, it really could lead to an impact for preventing retaliatory violence in particular, but also we're helping to further develop our youth in a way that leads them to be productive members of society.
This is always my least favorite part. Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
sorry.
Shannon. Finish your thought.
I was just going to add to that. I think an important point was raised about unsolved homicides. About 40% of homicides were unsolved in 2019. And this is particularly true for gun crimes committed against Black and Latinx people. And so, thousands of Americans never have their day in court. They see zero accountability. And so for survivors, we really have to raise awareness around this pervasive and horrible problem.
As everyone who attended accidentally saw when I messaged all of you, we had a lot of great questions that came in, and I would be able to spend an entire afternoon with these panelists. I think that this conversation just scratched the surface of all of the issues that I think are facing our communities and also us as a broader society. My hope is that for those who tuned in, you got a sense of the fact that, we can pursue policies that will make an actual difference. And that also there's a component of being able to recognize the humanity in others. So that's one of the privileges of the university, is to be able to bring different voices together that represent all of these different pieces to solve this puzzle in a way that hopefully will save lives and will spare others of going through the trauma that we have unfortunately allowed so many others to go through. So I appreciate everyone who attended for giving us a few minutes of your time today. And I especially appreciate you, Lahidra, for managing such a wonderful conversation, Brenda, Selwyn, Franklin, and Shannon. And thank you for sharing your thoughts today. And more than that, thank you for your commitment to this work on an everyday basis. It's not easy, and it's obviously very emotional at times too. And so recognizing what you all brought to this conversation, we're just really appreciative.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And also, if you want to learn more about the Urban Network, which I should probably put in a last minute plug, you can go to urban.uchicago.edu and look at some of the conversations we've already hosted and some that might be happening in the future. So appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.